Right on February 1st, 2025, a single law quietly passed in Brussels. Not a headline, not a spectacle, just a date, a deadline, a line in the sand that will reshape the entire global energy architecture for the next 50 years. By 2027, every cubic meter of Russian pipeline gas flowing into the European Union will be permanently cut off. Not reduced, not renegotiated, terminated. This isn't a sanction. This isn't a temporary measure. This is the legal dismantling of a 70-year energy dependency that powered the largest economic bloc on the planet. And if you think this is just about Europe and Russia, you're already behind. Because what's happening right now is the fourth stage of a pattern that has repeated itself across every major empire, every dominant power structure, and every resource-based hegemony in recorded history. A pattern so predictable, so mathematically consistent, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the consequences? They're not coming. They're already here. Let me show you something. In the last 18 months, European natural gas prices spiked by 340%. Industrial output in Germany, the manufacturing heart of Europe, contracted for 6 consecutive quarters. Energy-intensive industries, steel production, chemical manufacturing, automotive supply chains, they didn't just slow down. They started relocating. Permanently. And here's the thing. This wasn't a surprise. This wasn't an accident. This was the inevitable result of a systemic shift that was set in motion decades ago. And the new EU law. It's not the cause. It's the final confirmation of a transition that was always going to happen. The only question was when. Now we know. 27 months. That's how long the old system has left. And if you don't understand the pattern behind this shift, if you don't see the stages that led here, you won't understand what comes next. And what comes next will determine who wins and who loses in the largest energy redistribution in modern history. So let's break this down. Let's look at the pattern. Because this isn't new. This isn't unprecedented. This is the 4th time in the last century that a dominant energy relationship has collapsed under its own structural contradictions. And every single time, it followed the exact same 4-stage process. Stage 1, setup and foundation. A powerful supplier establishes dominance through resource control and strategic infrastructure. The buyer becomes dependent, not just economically, but politically and strategically. The relationship is mutually beneficial. It creates stability, it creates growth, it creates interdependence. Stage 2, expansion and overextension. The supplier leverages its position for political gain. It uses energy as a weapon. It manipulates prices. It threatens supply cuts. The buyer starts to realize the vulnerability, but the cost of transition is too high. The infrastructure is locked in. The contracts are long-term. The alternatives are undeveloped. So the relationship continues, but trust erodes. Stage 3, crisis and loss of control. A geopolitical shock, a conflict, a sudden supply disruption forces the buyer to confront the dependency. Prices spike. Industries suffer. Public pressure mounts. Governments are forced to act. The buyer announces a transition plan, diversification, new suppliers, alternative energy sources, but the timeline is long. The infrastructure takes years to build. The supplier believes the buyer will come back. They always do. Stage 4, inevitable outcome. The buyer accelerates the transition faster than anyone predicted. New infrastructure comes online. New suppliers fill the gap. Technological alternatives scale rapidly, and suddenly the old supplier is locked out. Permanently. Not because of politics, not because of morality, but because the buyer has rebuilt the entire system without them. The relationship is over irreversibly. That's the pattern. 4 stages every time. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about oil, gas, coal, or strategic minerals. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the 1970s, the 1990s, or right now. The pattern repeats. The timeline compresses. The outcome is the same. And once a stage 4 begins, there's no going back. So let's prove this. Let's look at the historical record. Let's examine 3 cases where this exact pattern played out in real time. The infrastructure was built. The refineries were designed for Middle Eastern crude. The relationship was stable. American demand funded Middle Eastern development. Middle Eastern oil powered American growth. Everyone was winning. Stage 2 was the overextension. In October 1973, in response to U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, OPEC declared an oil embargo. Prices quadrupled overnight. Gas lines stretched for miles. Industries shut down. Inflation spiked to double digits. The embargo lasted 6 months, but the message was clear. Oil was now a political weapon. The U.S. was vulnerable, and OPEC knew it. Stage 3 was the crisis. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 triggered a second oil shock. Supply disruptions pushed prices even higher. The U.S. economy entered a severe recession. Unemployment surged. Public anger reached a breaking point. In response, the U.S. government launched the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, mandated fuel efficiency standards, and accelerated domestic exploration in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. But these were long-term solutions. In the short term, OPEC still had control. Stage 4 was the outcome. By 1985, everything had changed. Alaskan oil was flowing. North Sea production from the UK and Norway flooded the market. OPEC's market share collapsed from 50% to less than 30%. Prices crashed. Saudi Arabia tried to defend prices by cutting production, but it didn't work. The US had diversified. The dependency was broken. And OPEC never regained the leverage it had in the 1970s. The pattern played out in 12 years. Check, verified, undeniable. Case 2. Western Europe and Soviet oil during the Cold War, 1960 to 1991. Stage 1, the setup. In the 1960s and 70s, Western European nations, particularly West Germany, France, and Italy, began importing cheap Soviet oil and gas. The economics were compelling. Soviet energy was abundant and underpriced. The infrastructure was built. Pipelines stretched from Siberia to Berlin. The trade was lucrative for both sides. The Soviets earned hard currency. Western Europe powered its post-war economic miracle. Stage 2, the overextension. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was using energy exports as political leverage. It pressured European governments on NATO policy. It threatened supply cuts over political disputes. In 1981, the Reagan administration warned Europe that Soviet energy dependence was a strategic vulnerability. Europe dismissed the concerns. The contracts were in place. The infrastructure was sunk. The alternatives were expensive, but the warning was real. Stage 3, the crisis. In the late 1980s, the Soviet economy began to collapse. Oil prices crashed. Soviet production stagnated. Supply disruptions became frequent. And then, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The entire energy relationship was thrown into chaos. New nations controlled the pipelines. New governments set the terms. Europe realized it had built its energy security on a state that no longer existed. Stage 4, the outcome. By the mid-1990s, Europe had completely restructured its energy sourcing. It diversified to Norwegian gas, North African liquefied natural gas, and increased nuclear capacity. The former Soviet states, now independent, lost their monopoly position. Russia inherited the infrastructure, but not the leverage. Europe had learned the lesson. Never again would it allow a single supplier to control its energy future. The pattern took 30 years. Check, verified, undeniable. Case 3, Japan and Middle Eastern oil, 1973 to 2011. Stage 1, the setup. In the 1960s, Japan had no domestic energy resources. It imported over 99% of its oil, almost entirely from the Middle East. The Japanese economy was built on cheap oil. Its manufacturing miracle, automobiles, electronics, steel, depended on stable energy supplies. The dependency was total. Stage 2, the overextension. The 1973 oil embargo hit Japan harder than any other developed nation. Prices spiked, growth halted. The Japanese government realized the vulnerability but had limited options. It began diversifying suppliers, increasing imports from Indonesia and Mexico, but the Middle East still dominated. The infrastructure was locked in. The refineries were designed for Middle Eastern crude. Change was slow. Stage 3, the crisis. The 2011 Fukushima disaster shut down Japan's entire nuclear power industry overnight. Suddenly, Japan needed to replace 30% of its electricity generation. It turned to liquefied natural gas imports. Prices surged. Japan was paying a premium for emergency supplies. The dependency deepened, but this time, the crisis forced a fundamental rethink. Stage 4, the outcome. By 2020, Japan had completely transformed its energy strategy. It diversified LNG suppliers across Australia, the United States, Qatar, and Russia. It invested heavily in renewable energy. It restarted nuclear reactors under stricter safety protocols. And most importantly, it built strategic reserves and flexible import infrastructure so it could switch suppliers at will. The Middle Eastern oil dependency that defined Japan for 50 years was broken. Not eliminated, but diversified to the point where no single supplier could hold leverage. The pattern took 47 years. Check, verified, undeniable. 3 historical cases, 3 different regions, 3 different energy sources, but the exact same 4-stage pattern. Setup, overextension, crisis, outcome. And every single time, the outcome was the same. The buyer broke the dependency, permanently. Now let's apply this to Europe and Russian gas. Because what's happening right now isn't just similar to these historical cases, it's identical, stage by stage, move by move. And the new EU law isn't the cause of this transition. It's the legal formalization of Stage 4, the inevitable outcome that was set in motion years ago. Stage 1, the setup. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia inherited the world's largest natural gas reserves and an extensive pipeline network built during the Soviet era. Western Europe, particularly Germany, saw an opportunity. Russian gas was cheap, abundant, and conveniently located. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Germany and other EU nations signed long-term contracts with Gazprom, Russia's state-controlled energy giant. New pipelines were built. Nord Stream 1 connected Russia directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea, bypassing transit countries like Ukraine and Poland. By 2021, Russia supplied over 40% of the EU's natural gas imports. For Germany specifically, the figure was closer to 55%. The dependency was deep. The infrastructure was locked in. Entire industries, chemical plants, steel mills, heating systems for millions of homes were built around the assumption of cheap, reliable Russian gas. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Russia earned over 100 billion euros annually from gas exports to Europe. Europe powered its economy with stable, affordable energy. It was the foundation of European energy security for 3 decades. Check. Stage 2, the overextension. Russia began using its energy position for political leverage as early as 2006. That year, Gazprom cut gas supplies to Ukraine in the middle of winter over a pricing dispute. The cutoff disrupted supplies to several EU countries that depended on pipelines transiting through Ukraine. The message was clear. Russia could weaponize energy. In 2009, it happened again. Another dispute with Ukraine led to a 2-week complete cutoff of gas to Europe in January, the coldest month of the year. European governments issued warnings. Think tanks published reports on energy security vulnerabilities. But the response was muted. The infrastructure was already built. The contracts were long-term. The alternatives, LNG imports, renewable energy, were expensive and undeveloped. So Europe kept buying Russian gas. In 2011, Germany approved Nord Stream 2, a second direct pipeline to Russia, doubling the capacity of the original. The United States warned that this would increase European dependency. Eastern European nations, Poland, the Baltic states, protested loudly. They remembered the Soviet era. They understood the risk. But Germany and other Western European nations dismissed the concerns. The economics were too compelling. Russia needed the revenue. Europe needed the gas. It was rational, it was pragmatic, it was stable, until it wasn't. Check. Stage 3, the crisis. On February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The entire geopolitical landscape shifted overnight. The EU imposed sanctions on Russia. Russia retaliated by cutting gas supplies. By September 2022, gas flows through Nord Stream 1 were reduced to 20% of capacity. Then, on September 26th, both Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged in underwater explosions. They were rendered permanently inoperative. European gas prices exploded. They reached levels 14 times higher than the previous year. Industrial production ground to a halt. Energy-intensive industries faced impossible cost structures. Governments scrambled to secure alternative supplies. Germany signed emergency LNG contracts with Qatar and the United States. The EU mandated gas storage requirements. Member states introduced energy rationing plans. Protests erupted across Europe over skyrocketing heating bills. This was the crisis, the moment when the vulnerability became undeniable. But here's what most people missed. The crisis wasn't just about the war. The goal was to reduce Russian gas imports by 2/3 within 1 year and achieve complete independence as soon as possible. The timeline seemed impossible. The infrastructure didn't exist. The alternatives weren't ready. But something remarkable happened. Europe moved faster than anyone predicted. LNG import terminals that normally take 3 to 5 years to build were constructed in under 12 months. Floating storage and regasification units were leased and deployed across European ports. By the end of 2023, the EU had increased LNG import capacity by over 50 billion cubic meters per year. New supply agreements were signed with the United States, Qatar, Algeria, and Norway. Renewable energy deployment accelerated. Solar installations in Germany hit record levels. Wind capacity across the EU increased by 30% year over year. Energy efficiency measures that had been discussed for decades were implemented within months. Industrial consumers switched fuels. Chemical plants that ran on natural gas for 50 years converted to hydrogen and electric alternatives. And here's the critical point. By the end of 2024, Russian gas imports to the EU had fallen by over 80% compared to 2021 levels, not because of sanctions. The law mandates that by December 31st, 2027, all long-term contracts with Russian gas suppliers must be terminated. No new contracts can be signed. No extensions can be granted. The EU has legally committed to a future without Russian pipeline gas, and this isn't a symbolic gesture. Now here's what makes this different from every other time Europe tried to reduce Russian gas dependency. In the past, after the 2006 cutoff, after the 2009 crisis, Europe talked about diversification. Reports were written, goals were set. But nothing fundamentally changed. Why? Because the infrastructure wasn't there. Building LNG terminals takes years. Developing renewable capacity takes decades. Switching industrial processes requires massive capital investment. So Europe kept buying Russian gas because it had no alternative. But this time, the crisis was severe enough and long enough that Europe had no choice but to build the alternative infrastructure. And once that infrastructure was built, once the LNG terminals were operational, once the supply contracts with other nations were signed, once industries had converted to different fuels, going back to Russian gas stopped making economic sense. It's not about politics anymore. It's not about morality. It's about infrastructure. And infrastructure has inertia. Once it's built in a new direction, it doesn't go back. Let's talk numbers. In 2021, before the war, the EU imported about 155 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas from Russia annually. That accounted for roughly 40% of total EU gas consumption. By 2024, that figure had dropped to under 30 billion cubic meters. Where did the gas come from instead? LNG imports from the United States increased by 45 billion cubic meters. LNG from Qatar increased by 18 billion cubic meters. Pipeline gas from Norway increased by 15 billion cubic meters. Pipeline gas from Azerbaijan increased by 12 billion cubic meters. And the rest? Demand reduction, energy efficiency, fuel switching. Renewable energy displacement. The EU didn't just replace Russian gas, it restructured the entire system. And the economics now favor the new structure. LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas, but it's flexible. Europe can buy from multiple suppliers and switch based on price. It's not locked into long-term contracts with a single supplier. That flexibility is worth the price premium because flexibility is security. And after 30 years of dependency, security is priceless, undeniable. Now let's address the counter-arguments. Because I know what you're thinking. This time is different. Russia is too big. Europe needs the gas. The costs are too high. Winter will force Europe back. These are the same arguments that were made in 1973 about Middle Eastern oil, the same arguments made in the 1980s about Soviet energy, the same arguments made in 2011 about Japan's Middle Eastern oil dependency. And every single time, the pattern played out anyway. Let's be specific. Some people say Russia will just sell the gas to China and India instead. True. Russia is redirecting some exports to Asia, but here's the problem. The infrastructure doesn't exist. Building new pipelines to China takes a decade and costs tens of billions of dollars. The Power of Siberia pipeline, which opened in 2019, took 5 years to build and can only carry 38 billion cubic meters per year. That's less than a quarter of what Russia used to sell to Europe. And China is negotiating hard on price. Russia has no leverage. China knows Russia has nowhere else to sell, so Russia is selling at a discount. The revenue isn't replacing what it lost from Europe. Some people say Europe will suffer economically from higher energy costs. Also true. Energy costs in Europe are higher now than they were in 2021. Industrial competitiveness has declined. Some industries have relocated. But here's what matters. Europe has accepted this cost. The political will has shifted. European voters, who were once ambivalent about energy security, are now demanding independence from Russia. No government can reverse course without losing power. The transition has political momentum. And political momentum, once established, is almost impossible to stop. Some people say the EU law is just symbolic, that it will be watered down or delayed when reality sets in. This is the most dangerous misconception, because it misunderstands what the law actually is. The law isn't forcing Europe to do something difficult. The law is formalizing something Europe has already done. The infrastructure is built, the contracts are signed, the transition is complete. The law is just making it irreversible. And here's why that matters. Without the law, there's always a possibility that a future crisis, a cold winter, a sudden price spike, could push Europe back toward Russian gas. With the law, that possibility is eliminated. The legal framework makes the transition permanent. Future governments can't undo it. Future crises can't reverse it. The bridge has been burned, intentionally, permanently. Now let's zoom out. Because the implications of this go far beyond Europe and Russia, this is the first time in modern history that an entire economic bloc has legally severed a major resource dependency with a geopolitical rival. Not gradually, not ambiguously, completely, by a fixed deadline. And this sets a precedent. If Europe can eliminate its Russian gas dependency in less than 3 years, what else can be eliminated? Chinese rare earth imports, Middle Eastern oil. The message is clear. Resource dependencies that were once considered permanent, structural, irreversible can be broken. Quickly, if the political will exists, if the crisis is severe enough, if the alternative infrastructure is built fast enough. This changes the calculus for every nation that relies on resource exports for geopolitical leverage. It means that leverage is temporary. It means that buyers can and will diversify if pushed too far. And it means that the old model of energy geopolitics, where suppliers use scarcity as a weapon, is ending. What comes next is a world where energy security is based on diversity and flexibility, not monopoly relationships. A world where buyers have multiple suppliers and can switch at will. a world where renewable energy and domestic production reduce the strategic importance of imports. This is already happening. The United States is now the world's largest LNG exporter, not because it needs the revenue, but because energy exports are strategic assets in a multipolar world. Qatar is expanding LNG capacity to cement its position as a reliable supplier. Australia is building new export terminals. Norway is maximizing pipeline flows. These nations are filling the gap left by Russia. And once they fill it, Russia can't get back in. Because the buyers have learned the lesson. Dependency is vulnerability, diversification is security. And once the infrastructure is built for diversification, going back to monopoly dependency makes no sense. So what does this mean for you? What are the actionable takeaways from this pattern? First, understand that the energy transition in Europe is irreversible. If you're making investment decisions, strategic planning, or geopolitical analysis based on the assumption that Europe will go back to Russian gas, you're wrong. The infrastructure has been rebuilt, the contracts have been signed. Russian gas, long-term, single-supplier dependencies, inflexible infrastructure. Fourth, don't underestimate political will. The standard assumption in geopolitics is that economic interests override political commitments, that nations will always choose cheaper energy over security. That's not what this pattern shows. When the crisis is severe enough, when the political pressure is intense enough, nations will pay higher costs to break dependencies. They will accept economic pain to achieve strategic autonomy. Europe is paying more for energy now than it did in 2021, but it's not going back because the political consensus has shifted. And political consensus, once established, is more powerful than price signals. Fifth, timelines compress. In 2022, experts said it would take 10 to 15 years for Europe to replace Russian gas. It took 2 years. Why? Because crisis accelerates decision-making. It cuts through bureaucracy. It unlocks capital. It forces innovation. When the alternative is collapse, infrastructure that normally takes a decade can be built in 18 months. This will happen again. The next time a major resource dependency breaks, the transition will be faster than the experts predict. Plan accordingly. And finally, understand that we're watching the collapse of a 70-year energy order in real time. The European-Russian gas relationship defined European energy security since the 1960s. It survived the Cold War. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. It survived multiple crises and conflicts. But it didn't survive stage 4 of the pattern. And once stage 4 is complete, once the new infrastructure is in place, the old order doesn't come back, ever. This isn't a temporary disruption. This isn't a negotiating tactic. This is a permanent structural shift. And the February 2025 EU law is the legal declaration of that shift. Russia has lost the European gas market forever, not because Europe wanted to pay more, not because Europe was morally outraged, but because Europe built an alternative. And once the alternative exists, the monopoly ends. So when you see headlines about the new EU law, don't think of it as a political decision. Think of it as the final stage of a predictable, inevitable pattern that has played out 3 times before in the last 50 years. The pattern doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care about ideology. It follows structural logic. Setup leads to overextension. Overextension leads to crisis. Crisis leads to infrastructure transition. An infrastructure transition leads to a permanent outcome. Europe is in stage 4. The infrastructure has been rebuilt. The law makes it permanent. The pattern is complete. And if you understand this pattern, if you see how it's playing out right now, you can anticipate where it will play out next. By 2027, every cubic meter of Russian pipeline gas will be cut off. Not reduced, not renegotiated, eliminated. And this didn't happen overnight or by accident. It wasn't driven by morality, speeches, or symbolic politics. It happened because the 4-stage pattern of resource dependency collapse unfolded exactly as it always does, predictably, relentlessly, and without exception. First came the setup, decades of cheap, reliable energy that created comfort and dependency. Then overextension, deeper integration, bigger pipelines, higher leverage. After that, crisis, when energy became a weapon instead of a commodity. And finally, the inevitable outcome, structural separation. Once that stage begins, reversal is no longer possible. 3 historical examples already proved this pattern long before Europe reached this point. The current situation simply confirms it. And the February 2025 law didn't start the process. It locked it in. It removed ambiguity, deadlines, and hope of a return to the old system. If you're still betting on the old energy order, you're not early, you're late. The infrastructure has already been rebuilt. Supply chains have already shifted. Capital has already moved. The transition isn't coming, it's finished. The bridge hasn't just been crossed, it's been burned behind us. And the pattern, as history keeps reminding us, never fails.